Okay, imagine this. The big superpower standoff ends. And suddenly, it's not just about armies anymore. It's a whole new game.
A really different landscape.
Exactly. And we're going to dive into that post-Cold War world today using a really interesting opinion piece from Al Jazeera as our guide. It's from May 2023.
And this piece really digs into, well, how power works now. Not just military might, but also influence, attraction, soft power.
Right, and it touches on these big ideas about different cultures maybe clashing or maybe finding new ways to interact.
It's got a lot packed in there.
It does. So our mission here is to unpack the core arguments from this article. What's it really saying about conflict and influence today?
And maybe what that helps us understand about, well, everything going on around us.
Let's get into it.
So one of the first things the source points out, and it's striking, is that the end of the Cold War wasn't really the end of conflict people hoped for.
Yeah, it wasn't like peace just broke out everywhere.
Not quite. Instead, the article argues the nature of the conflict shifted. Dramatically, actually.
Yeah, how so?
Well, that clear U.S. versus Soviet Union, that bipolar world, it just dissolved. And what replaced it was much messier, more players, different kinds of struggles.
Okay, and you mentioned soft power earlier.
Yes. That became way more important alongside the traditional military stuff, the ability to, persuade or attract other countries.
Ah, so it's not just about who has the bigger tanks anymore.
Precisely. And the source highlights how the West, particularly the U.S., initially really tried to shape this new era.
They were pushing for a kind of new world order, wasn't that the phrase?
Mm-hmm.
Based on their own values?
That's the idea presented. Liberal democracy, free markets. Trying to spread that model through its appeal, its attractiveness. Leading by example, you could say.
Which connects to some pretty influential theories that were floating around back then, right? The source mentions them.
It does. It brings up two big ones. Francis Fukuyama's end of history idea.
Right. The theory that liberal democracy had basically won the ideological battle.
Initially, yeah. But then the source contrasts that with Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. A very different take.
Okay. Tell us about that one.
Huntington's argument, as presented in the source, was that the main conflicts of the future wouldn't be ideological or economic, but primarily cultural.
Cultural, like between different civilizations.
Exactly. He identified several major ones: Western, Islamic, Confucian, Hindu, Slavic Orthodox, and so on. He predicted the fault lines would be between these large cultural blocks.
So a very different prediction from Fukuyama's everyone becomes a liberal democracy idea.
Very different. And the article makes the point that while Fukuyama's idea had its moment right after the Cold War,
people were optimistic then.
They were. But Huntington's clash thesis, well, it gained a lot more traction over time, especially the source notes after events like 9/11.
Ah, okay. And it suggests this thinking actually influenced policy.
It does seem to suggest, that this clash framework became a lens, particularly for American foreign policy, for understanding global dynamics.
This really brings us back to that idea of soft power, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because if cultures are central, then how they influence each other becomes critical.
Absolutely. And the source defines soft power quite clearly. It's not force, not economic bullying.
It's attraction, persuasion.
Exactly. Getting others to want what you want through your culture, your political ideals, your values.
So things like movies, music, education.
All of that.
Yeah.
The source lists culture, values, political systems, media, arts, education, even consumer brands and lifestyles. These are all tools.
And the article argues Western soft power, especially American, was super influential initially.
Definitely. It was very effective, the source says, at promoting specific values globally. Individualism, liberalism, consumer culture.
And you can see the mechanisms, right? Universities attracting foreign students, Hollywood's global reach, news outlets.
Big corporations, too.
Yeah.
The source mentions institutions like these as key channels for projecting that influence, spreading ideas and lifestyle.
Like, there's always a but, isn't there? The article doesn't suggest this dominance just continued unchallenged.
No, that's a crucial counterpoint. The source argues pretty strongly that this Western soft power dominance is facing, well, significant challenges now.
Like what?
Well, for starters, the rise of other global powers. China is the obvious example cited, offering a different economic model, a different set of cultural values.
So competition, not just economically, but culturally too.
And beyond specific countries, the source talks about a broader trend. Non-Western civilizations are asserting their own values more forcefully.
Pushing back against Western influence.
In some cases, yes. resisting what might be seen as, cultural homogenization. The article even talks about a potential crisis of the Western epistemic and moral foundations.
Wow, that sounds serious. A crisis of its core ideas and values.
It's just a deep questioning, yeah. A challenge to the idea that Western ways of thinking or ethical systems are universally applicable or superior.
And the source links this to the idea of hegemony.
It does. It puts forward the perspective that pushing Western values too hard can be perceived by others as a form of intellectual and cultural hegemony.
Like one culture trying to dominate all the others.
Which, naturally, can provoke resistance. People want to affirm their own identity, their own worldview.
The source uses the Islamic world as a specific example to explore this, right?
Yes. It's presented as a key case study for these post-Cold War dynamics, particularly how that clash of civilizations narrative often got framed.
How so?
Well, the article points out that, especially after 9/11, the clash was frequently portrayed specifically as a conflict between the West and Islam.
Okay. And the source notes that some groups in the West did promote that view.
It mentions that, yes, that some conservative or right-wing circles viewed Islam itself as a kind of fundamental threat.
But the article offers another perspective on Islam.
It does. It contrasts that view by highlighting that, according to its interpretation, core Islamic teachings actually emphasize universal values: peace, justice, human dignity, things like that.
So it's pushing back against the idea of an inherent conflict.
It seems to be arguing against that inevitability. The source really emphasizes that the path forward isn't about one culture winning out over others.
What does it propose instead?
Genuine dialogue, real understanding between cultures based on equality and mutual respect, not imposing one set of values.
That sounds optimistic, but maybe necessary.
It leads to the article's main conclusion, really, that the future shouldn't just be accepted as this inevitable clash.
But rather as an opportunity.
An opportunity, exactly, for real intellectual and cultural exchange, recognizing that, hey, every civilization has something unique and valuable to contribute.
Respecting diversity, essentially. Avoiding that idea that one way is the only way, or the universally best way.
That seems to be the core message. The source argues that true progress comes from finding the shared human values that cut across these cultural differences.
Okay, so let's try and tie this all together. What are the big takeaways here?
Well, first, the Cold War's end didn't mean peace, but a shift. From a clear two-sided conflict to something much more complex, multi-sided.
Right. And power itself changed. It wasn't just military anymore. This soft power influence, culture, values became a huge factor.
Initially dominated by the West, trying to spread its model. But then you get the clash of civilizations idea gaining ground.
Especially framing conflict along cultural lines, sometimes specifically West versus Islam.
And now we're seeing challenges to that earlier Western dominance.
Right.
Other powers rising, other cultures asserting themselves, pushing back against perceived hegemony.
So the ultimate argument from this source is move past the clash.
Yeah. Move towards genuine dialogue, mutual respect, recognizing the value in cultural diversity rather than trying to impose one standard.
It definitely gives you a lot to think about regarding how nations and cultures interact today.
Absolutely. And maybe that leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. Considering all of this, the arguments about soft power, cultural clashes, the need for dialogue.
What role do you think cultural understanding truly plays in shaping global politics now and in the future?
Yeah. And if that era of maybe unchallenged Western influence is fading, what does a world with multiple powerful civilizations actually look like day to day? How does that work in practice?
Something to ponder as you watch current events unfold.